Hey guys, this is Patrick Sewin, and welcome to the Inside Look podcast, where I talk to different people about very interesting topics related to budo. Today's conversation is with Michael Hodge Sensei, Iaido 6th Dan of the Canadian Kendo Federation, and we talk about mistakes in Iaido, how to recover from that moment, how to prepare for situations, and dealing with general performance anxiety. Also present in this conversation is Ron Beck, Iaido 5th Dan of the All US Kendo Federation, and Peter Kim, Iaido Nidan. So without further ado, here's Michael Hodge.
I, like many students of a teacher, are the product of their teachers. I have been reading interviews from 8th Dan Hanshis, and it's funny because when you read interviews from even very senior teachers, one would think that they are islands unto themselves. In other words, that they have achieved a level so advanced that one would believe that they no longer exist with respect to their students, their teachers, and the larger organizations, even their dojos. So I say first and foremost, before we begin this discussion, that I am a product of my teachers. I am a product of their generosity, of their time, and their expertise. So in the event that this is made public, I do want to stress that if there's anything that I say that causes them to doubt my understanding of this very intricate martial art called Iaido, then please, I hope that they forgive me my trespasses. All right. Sorry, remind me where we're starting.
We have two topics. You can either go with maintaining composure during mistakes or dealing with failure.
Okay. As with any topic dealing with the martial arts, it's a very intricate topic. There's a simple answer and then there's an elaborate answer. The simple answer is that any propensity to make mistakes obviously is human, but it's also a reflection of your depth of practice. So one of the byproducts of correct practice is the ability to be more consistent and to avoid those things considered mistakes. However, to make a mistake isn't something that should be frowned upon. It should be something that is seen as an opportunity to improve, so long as one is conscious of when they make mistakes and does not outwardly dismiss them as something that should not be investigated. It's perfectly reasonable and acceptable to make mistakes. However, your practice, your serious practice, and your earnest practice will ultimately see to it that any major mistakes aren't something that occur very often. Okay? How would I address making mistakes? As I mentioned before, practicing a lot and practicing correctly is one way to address the larger issue of making mistakes. Secondly, I would say that it should be thought of as a learning opportunity. Making mistakes is not the end of the world. So how do we maintain composure when making mistakes? It's a good idea to see the mistakes as part of the performance because inevitably they will creep in one sense or the other, whether they are major mistakes or whether they are minor mistakes. So I would argue and suggest, and it might not be easy, particularly for those who are less experienced, to allow them to become part of the performance and then continue from that point forward. We want to maintain not so much a passive countenance, but an attitude that suggests, yes, I made the mistakes, however, let's move forward. Okay? In a lot of cases, if your mistakes are very subtle, those who are in a position to recognize those mistakes might not even notice them. So that's one benefit of reacting, I would say, neutrally to any mistakes that are made. But I can also tell you that how you handle those mistakes, and this is more so for those who are approaching intermediate to senior ranks, also reflects on your development as a martial artist.
Can I give two examples for you to talk about? One would be a very blatant, obvious one where in Gamenate, your saya goes into your hakama, and then you have to somehow recover from that. And a slightly less obvious one would be when you stumble a little bit. So you're not sure if the judges actually saw it. You're not sure if it make a huge difference, but it shakes you off of your focus. Maybe you can give your opinion on it.
Right. I would say the concrete advice that I could give is to wait until the end of the kata and then include it as part of your zanshin. Again, you can make that mistake gracefully and in such a manner that suggests that you are a highly trained person or someone who has practiced a lot and is not perturbed by the destabilizing effect of ending up outside the bounds of what it is that you're doing. Obviously, these 12 techniques are considered templates and often would be unnerving to find oneself outside the bounds of those template techniques. So yeah, make your mistakes and make them gracefully without overreacting. And secondly, stumbling falls into that category as well. You can stumble, but do your best to recover your composure as soon as possible. And if need be, take a step backward in your kata to recompose yourself so that you can begin the next phase of your technique or even the next technique as smoothly as possible.
How would you practice something like that? For doing a mistake like coming out there, you can just easily put the sai in. But for something where you're not planning, you never plan to stumble, it's always something that just happens. How would you work on preventing yourself from being caught off from something like that?
If something as major as a stumble happens, there is little that you could do to avoid perhaps a reaction from that. However, if you're not in, if it's a stumble that doesn't put you in either pain or cause you to react quickly, it's very simple to recover from that without any sort of major reaction, particularly as it applies to what it is that you're showing in your facial expression, I would say. Number one, it's the facial expression that tends to signal to others that we've made a mistake. Number one, avoid those if you can. And number two, simply regain your composure as capably as you can, perhaps even taking a step back in the technique and starting from that point. One example that I can give on that topic is when perhaps you've slipped a noto. Okay? One thing that I've learned from Stephen Cruz Sensei, for example, is that if you slip a noto, simply take a step back and end up at the end of your chiburi and then perform the noto again, this time even more deliberately to ensure that you don't make a mistake a second time.
Cool. I want to bring up one thing that I've thought about in terms of those type of slip-ups is when do they actually happen? They happen when I'm nervous, when my breath is higher up in my body, and so I have less feeling in my feet that keep me grounded. If all of this is up here and I'm trying to get air, I'll have a higher tendency of stumbling. To mimic that feeling in your practice, do active exercise. Make sure you're breathing hard, your blood is pumping. The other option is to volunteer to demonstrate as much as possible in class or at seminars, because those are the situations that you will face. And the more you experience, the more you get used to it. Stumble as many times as you want in class, and eventually they'll just be like, oh, I've done this before, and you won't feel that bad. I know that when we've had conversations, Ron, I've felt the same way. But over time, finding reasons to get yelled at has actually helped me. You're too tight. You're always floating. Blah, blah, blah. My brain tunes it out. And so that when I get into Taikai grading situation, I'm used to it.
Agreed. Performance anxiety is a big problem for many people, including myself. I can say and I can admit that even to this day, I still suffer from performance anxiety. Anyone would. Again, alleviating performance anxiety has a lot to do with your depth of practice. Over time, the mere act of practicing and becoming more and more familiar with the techniques, as you gain consistency, performance anxiety will naturally dissipate. At least I can speak from experience on that. It is also, breathing is important. As we know, kokyu, the act of modulating your breathing in order to combat any negative or adversive mindsets that would affect your practice, it's a very complicated topic. And there are different answers depending on who you are asking. But there are general rules. There's a general template on how to use the breath. And typically when you are executing any forward or positive technique or even striking technique, you'd want to exhale. And in between, you'd want to inhale. That's a general rule that may not work for everybody. What I find works for me is that, and everybody will ultimately, if they think about this, will find their own ability to relax. I would call that a relaxation response. And I say that as someone who's aware of the book called The Relaxation Response that was written many, many years ago. I haven't read it, but it's a book that outlines different ways of relaxing depending on circumstances. For me, what I do, and there may be parallels with this in other techniques regarding relaxing, is I take a huge inhale before I begin every technique, hold it for a few seconds, and then let it go. And visualize my energy sinking down toward the ground. And I say that because ultimately, as you mentioned, Patrick, as your breathing becomes more and more shallow, it tends to elevate up into your upper chest. And suddenly there's a whole lot of tension up here rather than diaphragmatic breathing, a type of breathing that will allow you naturally to center your weight, to ground your weight and allow the overall feeling as one being rooted to the floor rather than floating.
You mentioned that one diaphragmatic kind of breathing. What is something that whoever's listening on this call right now, what's the easiest, quickest way that they can start working on this and then build up like a habit?
Breathe deeply with the pit of the stomach. So both inhale and exhale allow the stomach to expand. I understand as Westerners that seems counter to how we naturally breathe. As Westerners, we tend to breathe from the chest, inhale in particular. In order to condition yourself for diaphragmatic breathing, And again, anyone who knows better than I do regarding diaphragmatic breathing, forgive any of my misunderstandings. However, you want to focus both your inhalation and exhalation from as low into the stomach as you possibly can, even closer to the tundan if at all possible. So the stomach represents the inhalation and the exhalation phases of breathing. So long as it's deep and even and in the pit of the stomach without allowing it to raise upward, creating any shallowness in breathing, and to, as a result, creating tension in your breathing, which would then reflect in your martial art.
I want to bring up a time that you made a mistake in the middle of some kind of kata in a demonstration or a tournament, and how you dealt with it. What did you think? What immediately came into your mind, and then what did you do to resolve that feeling?
Well, I could give you the example of our last Taikai that we had at Tobacco. I was up against a friend of mine from Montreal in, I think it was either a quarterfinal or semifinal, and I had switched the katas around. When I did that, I knew instantly that it had happened, and I recognized that mistake and ultimately realized that that mistake was part of the past and there was nothing I could do to fix it. I did not react. However, I continued on from that point and simply executed the remainder of the katas out of order naturally, but still filling the time that was allotted to me, up to 6 minutes. Okay, at the end of it, I ended up finishing within a respectable amount of time before that 6 minute time frame. And then from that point forward, I left it up to the judges to decide my fate.
Was that the first time you've done kata out of order?
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. In the past, I had made something of a habit of making that happen in Taikais. Thankfully, I have not done that in a grading as yet, but it is something that happens every now and then. And what do I attribute that to? A momentary lapse in attention, perhaps, but it isn't one worth reacting negatively to, but to simply understand that, A, Taikais are ultimately for your development. And I mentioned once again that mistakes are an opportunity to learn and to somehow figure out what to do for the next time around to minimize the chance that that happens again.
It looks like Peter has a question. Peter, if you don't mind, could you ask it?
Sure. So, to paraphrase, in other budo, there are like karate or jiu-jitsu or even kendo, maybe, I don't know, judo. We can do pressure testing. We can add resistance. We can fight against the technique. So other than cutting a lot of straw mats to see if you can cut properly, is there any other type of pressure testing that would sort of test to see if you're actually doing correct technique and under progressive resistance?
The very, very good question. Number one, video. Video is, in a lot of cases, it could be unnerving, seeing yourself and understanding that what you see on video might not reflect your internal understanding of where you are in your development. Number one, you see all these videos of teachers that you admire and you want to emulate what they do and try to be as consistent as they are. However, the reality in a lot of cases, particularly when you review your own performance from a video recording, doesn't always measure up to those ideals that you see and that you have in mind. So that is one aspect. I would say another would be to throw a lot of variables at your practice. What does that mean? It means that if you are performing any technique, say, ippomen mai, don't always do it at the same speed or the speed that you're expected to do it at. You want to pressure test. This is a lot like software bounds testing. You want to stress it until it breaks, and where it is that you need to draw back to avoid overcompensating and causing your technique to fall apart. So periodically, you want to stress test your techniques by practicing them as fast as you possibly can to see if you can hold it together without making any serious mistakes. On the same token, you want to perform your technique as slow as possible to see if you're able to maintain good, stable stances without any unnecessary or superfluous movement. Those are two excellent ways of doing that as well. Every now and then, particularly if you're rounding the intermediate and advanced stages, you want to break out of the template of your techniques and maybe experiment with shifting the expectation, maybe doing an extra chiburi, but you don't want to do that to such a degree that you'll end up doing that in either a grading or a demonstration. So my advice to you would be to throw a lot of variables, particularly going a lot faster than normal at times or going a lot slower at times. And above all, continue to assess your own development using video from all angles, not just in the front, but from the sides to ensure that your posture remains upright, that your stances remain good and solid and grounded. That is what I recommend.
I just want to build on that and say that I really like the term they use, pressure test, because it implies that there's something that is counter to what is easy for you. And I would say that's where you should want to look. You want to look at things that you're working on that just feel totally wrong or feel uncomfortable. You can just think about it as, oh, I'm working on this and I really don't like this kata. Maybe I should work on that a little more. When you think of something that just doesn't feel good to you, you should start thinking now, how can I work on that a little more so it doesn't feel wrong? That's the internal way. That's a little harder. The easiest way is when you get instruction from a senpai or a kohai even, or a sensei, especially the ones that you're like, you're totally wrong, I don't want to work on that. If you have a gut reaction, that's usually a sign that it's something that you should try to work on, because you don't want to disregard something that they see. We know a lot of senseis, especially the video of Sato Sensei that Mike has on his YouTube channel. I can't imagine many people, whether they are high level, low level, watching that video and saying, that doesn't look good. If you can get to a level where no matter who's looking at it, it looks good, that means even if you have a kohai giving you some kind of instruction that you hate, they're seeing something that you can work on, that you're naturally not doing. One way of actually making sure that you're covering all your bases in this case is to look for things that you don't want to work on, things that you don't believe in, and just work on that a lot more.
Very good point, Patrick. One of the challenges of practicing a martial art as subtle, yet as complicated as Iai, is to practice in such a way that you have an awareness of what it is your deficiencies are. I would say that the easiest and quickest way to improving is to practice or listen carefully to those that are in a position to instruct you, or as Patrick mentioned before, who have the eyes to see that you're performing something outside of the template that we've been given, and to work on those weaknesses, focusing specifically on them and lessening the chance that you make mistakes regarding those deficiencies in the future. Naturally, we all seem to want to find a comfort level in terms of what it is that we do. We seem to be more pleased with practicing the things, continually practicing the things that we're good at, yet neglecting the things that we should focus on. However, the quickest path to improvement is to have an awareness of those things that you're not so good at and to focus exclusively on them until they're no longer a problem or not as much of a problem.
I want to give a couple examples. After the last Taikai in March, the East Coast Taikai, I lost to Tak Furuta in the finals. And several senseis came up to me and gave me some advice. Secreta Sensei came up and said, when I was putting my sword in my belt, the kojiri wasn't in the center. I was bringing it too far when I was putting the sword in during opening etiquette. Paul said that I was doing this before my cuts. I was raising it up before coming forward. And Bannister Sensei said that I was leaning backwards quite a bit on most of my movements. Now, the thing that's the same for all of those instructions was my reaction, which in my mind, I was, no, I'm not doing that. I'm pretty sure I'm doing that correctly. There's a disconnect there. And then I started using video as Mike suggested. And I'm like, okay, I guess I could see where they're correct in that instance. And because it's so ingrained in me, because I feel like I'm doing it right, it means that I've been working on it for a long time, which also means that it'll take a long time for me to break that habit, to change it so that the next time I'm actually doing it correctly. And I'm still working on that.
Good point.
So we have another question from Ron. It's still related to this topic of mistakes. Ron, would you like to ask that to Mike?
I guess my question was, have you considered looking into what I'll call the source of what we'll call your performance anxiety is? If you really just sit with the question, like, what's the source of this? usually the first answer that will be revealed to yourself is not kind of what I call the essential source of what your performance anxiety is. So you have to keep asking yourself that question, what is it? What's at the core of this? And then when you really reveal what the core source is, suddenly it'll have, less impact, less effect on you at that point.
This is a good point, Ron, and I have thought about this. In fact, Patrick in a Facebook post alluded to this very recently. I think more than anything, the desire to do right by one's teacher. In other words, making major mistakes seems to be an affront to one's teacher in the way that they didn't teach you that, yet you're making these mistakes. So the desire to please is one aspect that A, causes a lot of anxiety, and B, raises or elevates the anxiety levels to the point where mistakes start to happen. So the desire to perform correctly, to make one teachers proud, is a lot of pressure. And I do think that is one of the major sources of anxiety when it comes to performing in the moment.
Ron, I know that you've had some thinking about this in the past too, about your source of performance anxiety. Do you have something you could share?
Yeah, so initially I would say exactly what Michael said, but then I started looking at it more and more. I got involved with seeing a therapist to look at it more deeply. And it struck me that I could be in my room as a kid and my dad would just come bursting into the room, a lot of anger coming out about something that I wasn't even anticipating. That kind of got to where it was. So I had to admit the source of this is a fear. It's a fear. I don't want to disappoint my instructor, or maybe when you're in a taikai and the judge that's sitting directly in front of you is somebody always saying you're doing this, you're not doing that, or whatever it is, like some of the examples you gave. So now you're kind of on the hot seat. I definitely don't want to do that or not do something if other person's directly looking right at me. But for me, it was more than that, because I could look at the exit door. Like if we went down to Jersey City, you look at the exit door, once you've walked 8 paces outside the door, that whole sphere that you've decided to get yourself in the middle of doesn't exist anymore. It's like nobody outside that building has any sense of what's going on in there. And so I kept thinking it had to be something more than that. I came back to this fear that I had of some authority person like my father just suddenly abruptly started yelling at me or something like that. That's why, let's say, I'll give Sensei as an example. It doesn't work for me to have him yelling at me. All I hear or all I get out of that is that he's angry or upset or whatever. It's just conveying some negativity to me that I don't have anything that I can do with. It's not like you're too slow, you're too fast, you're too high. I can work with something like that. That's information. But just the emotion, the anger, it just doesn't work for me. So there's that aspect of it.
Thank you, Ron. Mike, actually, that's a good topic to bring up. You're often the source of some of that yelling. How have you been able to deal with that? I have so much respect for your ability to stick to it and to take it as something that you can learn from and gain from. You have a lot of inner strength in that way. Where does that come from?
Allow me to go off on a tangent moment on that particular point. I went to the office today to take care of some business, and on my way there and back, I thought about the Japanese concept of ura and omote, U-R-A and omote. Tangibly, ura and omote have very simple meanings, and that's inside and outside. When we wear the sword edge up in the belt, the side that faces toward the center of the body is called ura. That's the inside of the sword blade, and on the outer side where the kurigate is omote. However, it has deeper meanings in Japanese culture. For example, in the context of an organization, let's say Toshiba or Nikon, the camera company, me being a photographer, refers to the outward face that the company likes to show. And then ura represents the combination of both the outward face and the inward face. It's particularly focusing on the inward face. So all of the politics, all of the machinations that go on the inside, the organizational tussling, the boardroom meetings that may not have 100% agreement or disagreement, all of the contesting elements that go into the final product that represents the growth of a particular organization. Those things are ura. So I like to say that the omote aspect, the outward facing aspect of being yelled at, I believe this to be a compassionate discipline, in the sense that I feel that I would not be worthy of their wrath, or their benevolent wrath, if they didn't believe that I were capable of being better, of doing better, of performing better. So in that sense, the omote, or the benevolent aspect of being yelled at, despite it sometimes feeling as if it's a negative experience, is that I believe that to be ultimately for the better. And we always hear stories of those typically more advanced in age, perhaps remembering an English teacher or a grade school teacher, or even a principal who was very, very strict. However, in hindsight, can be referenced again as somebody who made a significant impact upon one's life. And I look at it that way. So although I have been the target of some raised voices, some firm advice, in the largest sense, I see it as little more than compassionate firmness. I regard those types of encounters as beneficial, and I see them as little more than such. However, I also want to add that, yes, they are unpleasant experiences. However, they are experiences that I think are necessary, much like failure, that at some point we will cover because it is part of the agenda. I see them as a way of causing an earnest student, a way of maintaining or at least overcoming complacency. We often get to a point where we practice so much and then we fall into a pattern. We fall into a pattern not just of execution, but of expectation. And every now and then I do believe it is beneficial to a earnest student to be yelled at, just as long as it is not in a manner that's cruel, but is in a manner that's constructive and for the better of that person's development. Every now and then I do believe that we all need some of that, okay? In a lot of cases, if you find yourself not being yelled at or not being given stern advice, I would argue that, and again, this is part of the complexity that is the Japanese art of Iaido and martial arts, I would wonder whether perhaps an instructor does not see you worthy of such a response. However, that in my mind is part of the ura aspect of the martial arts. One does not want to think about not being in a teacher's favorable view. However, if we're told or corrected too much, that also seems unfavorable, but it also can be looked at as favorable advice. So this is what I have to offer regarding that aspect.
Cool, thank you. And if anyone on this call feels like they haven't been yelled at enough, Mike is available to yell at you at some future date. We are at the time. Because we got through one topic, I would like to ask Mike to come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel, so we can at least go through that second conversation. I think that it's a valuable conversation to be had.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So a week from today.
Yep. So for everyone else as well, I'm repasting those links. One link is a forum to recommend a guest, and the other one is feedback. The feedback form, please go there. It's a very quick, it should be like, I don't know, 30 seconds for you to fill it out. You could help us do this better. The other thing I've realized too is that not only Sensei can contribute to these type of conversations, a lot of you guys would have something interesting to say. So as I hear you talk more, and hopefully you will, like Ron and Peter, I might hear enough that I will invite you guys to be the main spotlight guest to talk, because I would like to ask you some questions as well. And for those of you that haven't said anything in this call, I still know you personally, and I think you have something useful to share, so hopefully I'll get you on in a future episode. So before I close this, what is the status of Michael's trip to Japan in the fall?
That's a good question. That is undetermined. I'm hoping. I still have my plane ticket purchased, but I haven't done any organizing beyond that. I have not booked any hotels. I have not examined how I will get from point A to point B. But I am still believing that it is far enough into the future that I'm able to still make the trip. I will be going for 2 weeks at the end of October toward the first week in November. And at this point, I have no reason to believe that I will be unable to make that trip.
So just a thing on that, it might be really tricky to predict, but they might ask you to quarantine yourself for 2 weeks.
I've thought about this, and that will ruin my vacation because I am going for. I'm maintaining vigilance in the sense that if I'm not able to travel or if I'm forced to quarantine, I may look toward either getting a refund or taking a travel voucher so that I can reschedule my trip for a year onward.
You might have to get the whole brain tickler test before you get on the plane, and then I don't know, maybe after. That still might not be enough, but
nightmare. Hopefully they can go to the back.
fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
All right. Good seeing you, everyone. Thanks, Cosmin. See you, Peter. See you, Ron. Good seeing you, Jonathan. Sandy, Oscar, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you'll come next week again.
Yes.
And bring some questions.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Patrick.
Have a good night.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.